Well, welcome to another episode of the Edufuturists podcast. We are really, really pleased to have gone over that 300 episode milestone. And if you've been listening to all 300, what else have you been doing with your time? I don't understand what you've been doing, but thank you for being with us. We are now into the next era, and we're very, very pleased to be joined by another guest in the studio today, as you can see, who will introduce himself very, very shortly. But Mr. Hawke, we made 300. What's the plan now to 400? I must asking you on the spot because we haven't even prepped this.
Is that a year? Is that 2 years? I don't know. I think we're accelerating at pace. So who knows? We could by next week have recorded all of those and just not sleep. But let's see how we get on, I guess. But yeah, no, it's great. I think there's the podcast is our stable footing and foundation. But obviously, we had the uprising. I want to say a couple of weeks ago, almost a week ago, but about probably a month ago, really, actually, in the history of time. And it was more successful than ever. I think we go through all of that and it gets bigger and bigger every year. So I'm excited for what's going to be the progression of the podcast, but also everything else. And we had some wonderful stuff that we posted, I think, on LinkedIn in regards to the Edufuturists and the Wolfpack out in the wild. So more of that, actually seeing people face to face rather than just recording online as well. But no, it's great, mate. Loving it, and here's to the next 300 and the next 9 years.
Absolutely. I don't reckon it'll take us 9 years to the next 300, just saying. But we have got a guest in the studio, and we are very, very pleased to be joined by John Tomsett, and I think he'll tell us a little bit about himself very, very soon. Just to give a bit of context, we are really pleased to be partnering again with Crown House Publishing. You could see I'm drinking. If you're watching, I've got one of my Be More Tim books, a Crown House Publishing book about unfinished business from the wonderful Mick Waters, David Cameron, who wrote about their friend Sir Tim Brighouse, who was a good friend of ours and came on the podcast. And yeah, you're in good company, John, of people that have been on in the past. But thank you for joining us, John. Tell us a little bit about you and what you've done.
Well, can I just begin by saying thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm delighted to be here. I taught for 33 years. I was 18 years a head teacher in two big secondary schools. And for the last 14 years of those 18, I was head teacher at Huntington School in York, one of the first research schools. We did lots of really lovely, great stuff. Worked hard with the EEF and in its original form. Did a really great project with a bloke called Professor Rob Coe and Professor Stuart Keim, who now run evidence-based education up in Sunderland. Learned a lot from that. Did a lot of work with people like Becky Francis, Becky Allen, Alex Quigley was my head of research. John Yardley, you might have heard of, is a CEO who's doing great things at the moment in the East Riding. So I did all that kind of stuff, and then in 2021. In summer of 2020, I had my pacemaker battery replaced. And so I thought at that point I could see 60 coming at me like a train. I thought, enough. I've got other things to do. So I stepped down in September 2021, August 2021. And for the last 4 years, I've been absolutely blessed. Going around the country, watching lots of people teach, writing lots of books. In September, my 13th book comes out. That's 12 books on education. One on fishing. My favourite one is the one on fishing, if I'm honest, which I loved writing. And the last time I got some royalties for my fishing book, it was £1.28, and I think I bought that copy. But it remains a cherished piece of writing for me. And so I've not retired. To use Isabel Allende's line, who's still writing at 82, I've just retired from things I don't like doing. And I like doing stuff like this. I like writing, going around to see people teach, and that, just working with people like Tom Sherrington, Mary Meyer. It's been utter privilege, and just doing really lovely stuff. And I've got ironically, a deeper, better understanding of teaching and learning now than I ever had in my 33-year teaching career. So it's been really interesting. And I think my two latest books, which I think we're going to discuss, has been some of my favourite work, and we'll have a chat about that as we go through.
When you're a head teacher and you're in the thick of education, you can even though you're connected and you can often be focused on the driver of one organisation, and I know that you've been privileged to work with other people, but does the travelling, does the connections that you now have and the writing, does that allow a more of a bird's eye view approach of actually education and in the classroom rather than just what you're leading in terms of the and the echo chamber potentially that you're in? Does it give you opinions and other perspectives?
So I've been to Sweden to see lots of teaching in Sweden. Just been to Australia last week before last in Melbourne, see some teaching there. I think teaching is teaching, right? I think what works in the classroom works in every country, and largely works everywhere. And there's some good bets and some bad bets about what works in the classroom. What I've learned, really, ironically, Steve, is I had quite a good systems leadership view of things. I was chair of York Schools and Academies Board for 5 years, all the way through COVID. We met 3 times a week during COVID for 18 months. I chaired every one of those meetings bar one when I had my battery replaced. And what I've now got is a really deep understanding of where we are at the moment with our thinking about teaching and learning. So it's actually, I've gravitated down to the detail of what really matters. And that's been great. I've learned a lot from Tom Sherrington, working with him. When you're co-observing a lesson with Tom Sherrington, you've got to work really hard, right? You've got to know your stuff. And last week I was in Newcastle, and we'd got 25 colleagues in a room, and we were going through Tom's walkthroughs, and we were using the 25 colleagues as the class, and we were enacting the walkthroughs. And when you're presenting Tom Sherrington's work in front of Tom Sherrington, you can't be on your game. You can't be rubbish. So actually, ironically, I've learned much more about the detail, and I wish I'd had that knowledge as a teacher. I used to do a talk near the end of my career called 25 Years of Hurt, which was actually I admitted for the first 25 years of my career, I didn't really know what I was doing. I got by on force of character and enthusiasm. I hadn't thought about how learning happens. And if you don't have an overview or a sense, some kind of sense of how learning happens, how can you design teaching that is going to best create the best learning, right? How if you don't know how learning, have an idea how learning might be happening, how can you set up teaching that's going to maximize learning? It's just an obvious point, but one I missed for a long time.
I definitely hear that about if 25 years of hurt, and I love the nod to the football years of hurt as well. but I think you're right. The whole, we're winging it, and we learn how to do it, but then really drilling down into what learning is and why it matters and how it matters. We wrote in our latest trends booklet that many of the listeners will have read or will have a copy of if they've been at the Uprising event. And one of the things we talked about was about purposeful education, about the purpose of learning, redefining that purpose. And in that, we referred to Tom's work on rainforests and rainforest learning, and about shoots of good practice, and how we develop that. So I wonder, just before we get into talking about the 2 new books that we're going to talk about today, if you could just maybe give us an insight into that, because obviously you had to present about Tom Sherrington's theory in front of Tom Sherrington. What did you pick up, and what might be relevant in that future of education conversation?
I think there's some core practices that we don't get right. So I think one of them is checking for understanding in the room, right? Have you made at least an effort to find out whether every single child in the room is with you, has understood what you tried to teach them and you wanted them to learn, right? And I see so often that not the case, and it's not criticism, it's just hard, right? But what I really want, what Tom is after, I think, is people becoming more intentional in their teaching, thinking with your radar on, being almost slightly meta about the way you teach. So you're thinking all the time. You're doing what we call situational assessment. Where are we at the moment? What's happening in the room? What's happening in those corners of the room? And what do I need to do about it? Right? And has Johnny in the far right hand corner, has he been paying attention? And have I checked for his understanding? And if I haven't, I need to do something about it. And I think what we've done since 2017, since Spillman took over at Ofsted, we've been obsessed with content coverage and sequencing and content. We've forgotten a bit about pedagogy, and we've certainly forgotten about checking for understanding. And they are three corners of what I call the curriculum triumvirate. So the content, we decided what we want them to learn, we teach it in a way we hope they'll learn it, and we check for understanding, right? And if they haven't learned it, we've got to go back and learn and reteach it. And we don't do that. We just plow on, right? What Mary calls the curse of content coverage. And we have to be better at checking for understanding and create what Dylan William calls is flex in your curriculum design, which gives you the space to stop and reteach stuff if the children haven't learned it first time. But you've got to check for understanding first. And that's what Tom and I talk about all the time. You know, we sit in lessons and we imagine what it's like to be a pupil in that lesson. And the teacher goes going, blah, 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 blah. Okay, everybody got that? Yeah, right, okay, can we carry on? And you speak to Johnny in the corner, and Johnny says, I haven't got a clue. Right? You say, what's going on then, Johnny? What have you got to do next? Don't know, sir. No idea. And the teacher's lost contact with what's happening in the room and the level of understanding in the room. So that's the bit I learn. And I just hope we can focus on those. We can get to the point of unconscious competence in some core pedagogic practice about questioning, checking for understanding, those kinds of things. I mean, if you can do that and be completely confident that when you go down the very fundamentals of the dialogic process in teaching, if you're unconsciously competent at those, and then you can just be yourself and be that lovely person in the class. You're not weighed down by diktat, and you're like the people I talk about in the books who are having great fun in lessons. They're being themselves. They're free to really teach and really be passionate about stuff, because they know when they check around the room and they're asking questions and they're putting pressure on for every child to answer, that's really done well.
Just on that one then, John, I think a question to ask is in regards to, Ben's mentioned this quite often on the podcast, in regards to creating space in our education content that actually it's jam-packed of all of this content. And I think, and we'll dive into the 9 primary and 11 secondary teachers and all those kind of things, but ultimately, collectively across education holistically in England, have we created too much content where teachers are shackled by their ability to go back and check, because what's on their scheme of work is what they have to get through and deliver, and ultimately it's a case of, I might have missed a few, but as long as the collective get it and they're ready for an exam. We talk about assessment being the lead, and it's just been so ram-packed now that ultimately there is no space to ask, check, and go back. Is that kind of the thing that you're seeing en masse?
So 2 things to say on that. I've got to know through one reason or another. I've got to know a little bit. Dylan, I've interviewed him a few times. I'm on a board, the EBE board, and he's at those meetings. And he's really interesting. Mary asked him the question when we interviewed him a couple of years ago. What do you say to people who say there's too much to get through? And he said, on the curriculum. So he said you have to sort out the need to know from the need to know. So they need to know this, and it would be neat if they knew this, but it's not essential. And when you start doing that and ask really hard questions, you can find the odd lesson or two that creates flex. So I was working in a school not a million miles from you, up in the northwest, and I asked the subject leaders to come along with a scheme of learning, right? And it was a secondary school, and they came along. And the history teacher came along with a unit of GCSE work on slavery, 10 lessons on enslavement. And I said, what I want you to do is read through each of the lessons and decide which is the need to know and which is the neat to know. And he said, well, they're all need to know. I said, well, tell me what the titles of each lesson are. And he got to lesson 4, and it was a day in the life of a slave on a plantation. And I said, well, that sounds like it's neat to know, not need to know, right? It's not essential stuff. It's interesting, right? It'd be fascinating, but not need to know. He said, well, it is neat to know, because the abolitionists won their argument because they wanted people to emphasize what it's like to be a slave. I said, yeah, but it's still neat to know. It's not absolutely essential. And he kind of looked at me and he said, you're right, aren't you? It's just when you're so entrenched in it, you stop using your critical faculties because you so love the stuff. So instead of having that in lesson 4, he moved it to lesson 10 out of 10. And if in lesson 10 he retaught the key bits from the last 9 lessons, because some of them hadn't learnt it, it didn't matter if he missed that one out. If everybody had learnt it, then in the lesson 10 he can just teach that need to know stuff. So it's about being really, really critical about what we need to know and what we need to know. And the other thing about that is, I hope Becky Francis, I saw her speak last week, and I know Becky a little bit, and I'm pretty confident she will do some stuff that will be helpful to clear the decks a little bit in curriculum content. I think primary maths, I think it's massively overblown. I think you can get by. If at the end of year 6 they knew the 4 operations, fractions and decimals, place value and the number system, that's all we want. They don't need to do geometry in year 3. It's nonsense. And those children that come into secondary in year 7 who are weak writers, right? They've got no flag, but they're just weak writers, typically, but not universally, not 100% boys, right? They've got no flag. They're not additional needs. They just don't write very much, and they don't know what a verb is, right? They don't know what a sentence is because they don't know what a verb is. They're not secure on that. So why are we teaching them fronted adverbials, right, when they don't know what a damn verb is? Right? If you just got them to be able to write solid sentences by the end of year 6 without any of the faff, we would be fine, right? And I think so. So I think there's some good stuff will come through. I'm confident in Becky, and then you can get that flex, Steve. But I know what it's like. The head of department says on March 18th I've got to be at that point. I can't stop. But every time you do that, you're leaving people in your wake. And if you think about if every teacher does that from year 1 through to year 11, there are pupils who in year 10 think I'm so far bloody behind in this education competition, I may as well give up, right? And that takes 2 forms. I stay in bed, or I just cock about in lessons and I disrupt lessons, right? Those are the 2 things that happen because they're so far behind that even if they transform themselves in year 10 into model students, they've been so far left behind incrementally over the years that they just don't know where to start.
Yeah. And maybe a third there. Those individuals that don't stay in bed, come to school, they're technically classed as present, but they're the ones who are in the bays or whatever you call them, and in the play. They're trying to herd up my speaker, trying to herd up all of those individuals.
They're vaping in the toilets, whatever.
And I think it's we've had Paul Dix on, we've had all those people in terms of actually, I've got 2 young children, I've read books on, there's no naughty children, all this kind of, in terms of all of those approaches. But actually, by trying to just focus on content and knowledge-rich curriculum and all that other stuff, that there's skills, there's development, there's holistic education. My daughter had her graduation from reception into year 1. Didn't even know that was a thing, but anyway, that is now. And I love it. But ultimately, when we're constantly focused on, and I spend often time with the school, I've actually worked, they didn't even realise, but I've been doing some work in terms of the digital space with them, behind the scenes, at top level, and then filtering through. And ultimately, the constant question I ask is the development of Ella holistically, rather than just the content and all of those. Great, absolutely great. But I often joke that I'm in a position, and my children are in a very different position now. I don't remember half of the stuff I covered at school. A lot of it is relevant, and it's great that I can explore that. But actually, there's things that you've just said in English, but also so much of that curriculum is irrelevant, but just filled to pack out the stuff, and we just don't have that space to go back to.
No, I mean, I'm always careful about this because I do believe in. Yeah, I'm a real cynic. I'm not cynical, but I'm a real question about when people say I've got high expectations. I've never heard a head teacher or a teacher or a school say I've got low to middling expectations of our children. But I see it all the time. I hear all the grand claims, and I go into a classroom and there's a 30 kids doing a twinkle worksheet for a half an hour, right? This has just been downloaded and photocopied. It's not good enough, and I think we have to pitch it up. But children like difficult stuff. They don't like being patronised. I think if you get, as I said, that fundamental questioning and all that stuff that I talked about with Tom, right, you can make the stuff irresistible, right? Our job is to make the stuff irresistible. Our job is, as Dylan Williams says, is to make those children at the end of the lesson be interested in stuff that an hour ago they weren't remotely interested in. That's our job. And if you start, if we move into the books, it was really interesting what I found out in these books. I can tell you the story about where they came from.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that about if you have that passion and zeal. It won't sustain you forever, because you've got to have some skills and some abilities, which I know that we'll talk about in here. But if you start from that position of, I enjoy working with young people, I enjoy my subject, and actually I want to see them achieve, which I think 90% of teachers, or maybe even 100% of teachers start out with, but it doesn't always land that way. But what I love about these books, and for those people, we'll put a link to these in the chat for those people who haven't yet read them. The books are called This Much I Know About Truly Great Primary Teachers, and what we can learn from them, and then exactly the same thing but for secondary teachers. And what I really love about this is that this isn't just a theory. It's grounded in theory. There's loads of research. There's loads of really good examples, and you've referred to Tom Sherrington, Mary Myatt. You talk about Dylan William. There's some Vygotsky stuff in there. There's some wonderful stuff theoretically. The memory models from Wellingham, all these wonderful things, but it's grounded in, these are actual teachers that we've watched, and this is what they do. This is the evidence. This shows what it is. So yeah, I don't know which one you want to start with, but I think there's some principles that go across them both, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you about. So I gave Tom what I've been delighted by, and this is just me being kind of, because I think these are lovely. It's lovely work. Is that I've commissioned Crow House to make me a dozen or so hardback copies with dust jackets, right, which are really lovely. Right? They're unbelievably lovely. So I gave a hard copy to Tom when I met him last week, and he read it read some of it on the way down on the train, and I saw him again this week, and at the end of the week, and he said, I'd forgotten, quote unquote, I'd forgotten how kind of dry some of the research theory stuff is. And I hadn't really read anything like this. He said, and you're right in the classroom with these teachers. You're right there as they're teaching. So I wrote them in the present tense, right? And what I loved about each profile was it kind of sated my desire to write narrative, right? So I just tell the story of being in the school for the day, meeting the teacher, meeting the head, etc., etc. But so that's what I love. And Crow House, quite near the end, said, should we call it Truly Great Teaching? And I said no, because it's about teachers. Right? If it's This Much I Know About Truly Great Teaching, it's just Tomsett pontificating about what he thinks teaching is, right? This is teachers doing their stuff, right? I use what platform I still have to promote other people, right? I'm 61 next week, right? So I'm an old git. I've had my stuff, but I'm passing the baton on to people who like Johnny Utley, to people who are still doing the work. And what I love about these teachers is one's 24, one's 66. They're still cutting the mustard in the classroom just brilliantly. And it came from, the idea for the books came from a conversation I had with Rob Coe last September. We were at Research Ed in London, and Tom and Raj Chand were presenting on a thing, they called it Moneyball for Teachers. So I went along, and they're doing a project for the National Institute of Teachers, trying to find a single data point to judge the quality of teaching, right? And a single data point for each teacher. There are 12 schools in Raj's trust. Every pupil of every teacher has an exam at the end of the academic year. So they finished it just like the first year of the 4-year project last August. And from starting points to end points for every pupil, you can get a single data point for the teacher. And they were advertising it a bit like Moneyball. If you know the film Moneyball, it's about the Oakland A's. They were rubbish. The baseball team, they were rubbish. And then they met this statistician. He said, you're looking at the wrong data point. Look at this data point instead of that one. And I think it was about, not who hits the ball a long way, but who gets home run, right? And then you might transform yourself. So they were a rubbish team. And they used this data-informed process, and they became a really successful team in about 2 years. It's a great story. So they were talking, Raj and Rob were talking, I know they were talking about using this data point for recruitment. So let's say Ben, Steve, John, we're 3 teachers going for the same job. Steve is a plus 0.4 grade of a teacher, which means his children get plus 0.4 grade higher than expectation. Ben is a plus 0.5 grade, and I'm a plus 0.1 grade. So you would just appoint Ben, right? Because clearly you're the best teacher because your students make most progress. So I put my hand up. And there were some grand fromages in the room, right? So Sam Sims is in the room, Becky Allen's in the room, Rob, Raj. And I said, look, I was a head teacher for 18 years, right? I've literally interviewed thousands of teachers. Some you meet on the morning and you shake their hand, look in their eye and go, yeah, you'll do. Yeah, you'll be fine for me. And some, and I did do this, some at the end of the day, you put your arm around them and you say, don't go into teaching. It'll be just dreadful. You'll hate it. It'll be a miserable life. And I got booed when I said that, right? And so they all started booing me. And I started laughing. And Rob said, okay, we won't do any of our research. We'll just rely on John Tomsett's infallible interview method for recruiting teachers. And they all started taking the piss. So I had a coffee with him afterwards. And I said, Rob, are you really going to spend 4 years doing a single data point to measure the quality of teachers? I said, surely opportunity cost is something else you might do. And he said, well, what? So I said, let me have a think about it. And we went off and see someone else present. So that was on the Saturday. On the Sunday, I wrote a blog. On the Tuesday, I wrote another blog. By Tuesday lunchtime, Crown House had given me a book deal. This much I know about truly great teachers and what we can learn from them. Because I said, look, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go around the country because I know lots of good teachers. And I know lots of people who know lots of good teachers. I'm just going to spend a day with lots of good teachers. So I started, my first visit was on the 4th of October. And they gave me the 6th of January as the deadline. So I hadn't written anything by the 4th of October. But I'd spoken to Alex Quigley and I said, Alex, have you got anything research-based which talks about the behaviours and attitudes of teachers that result in good pupils making good progress? And he said, well, Rosenshine published The Principles of Instruction in 2008, I think it was. But in 1971, he and Barbara First did some work on that very thing, on a book called Teacher Behaviours That Lead to Students Making Progress. And so everything I looked at was informed by that. And I got a grubby copy of it from York University Library, which is just great. And I read that, picked out the salient bits from it. And what he did in that meta-analysis was pick up on 11 different behaviours and attitudes that might merit further research, right? Really interesting. 1971, tentative stuff. And very, you can see the foundations for the principles of instruction, right? It was really interesting. So I looked at it through that lens, and I ended up visiting 18 or 19 truly great teachers, primary and secondary, and one in special. And I would go to the school. I'd meet the head or the principal. I'd go and see them teach. I'd interview the pupils. I'd interview them themselves. I would get testimonials, and then I would also look at their progress data. Right? So you get a really full 8,000 word profile of each teacher in the book. And I wrote it in the present tense, so it felt really immediate. And you were there in the lesson with them. You were there in the room talking to the pupils and talking to the head, and talking to them themselves. So it's an interview process, the interview transcript. I at the end of the book, I draw together what I think are my 10 commonalities that each teacher demonstrated in one form or another. And I think those 10 are really fascinating. And just to let you know what the 10 are, the first one was teach with enthusiasm. Who knew? The second one was explain things with clarity. The third one was vary your pedagogic practice. The fourth one was be organised and purposeful. They do not like teachers who turn up and have to go back out and get another 5 photocopies because they've done the wrong number. Right? Those first 4 were verbatim the same as Rosenshine from 1971. And then I had a few more. So have genuinely high expectations. As I said, not low to middling. Check for understanding. So you're doing that stuff I've talked about the curriculum triumvirate. have a really confident understanding of the content, go round and help individual pupils, don't sit at your desk, build positive working relationships. And then the last one, because we always need 10, they were 9. The building positive relationships is really interesting, because Tom Bett and I row about this all the time in a nice way. So Tom will say, where's the evidence for that? But the evidence is all 19 teachers saying exactly the same thing, that unless you've got a positive working relationship with these children, nothing happens. Right, and they all say it. You can teach as formally as you want. Every 2 minutes you do this, you do that, you do the other, all this, all the slant stuff. But if you haven't got that respectful working relationship with the children, you've got no chance. And then my 10th, which I reflected on, and I think is really interesting. And I was never a super fan of pupil voice, but I'm much more tuned into pupil voice now. Is that they know who the lead swingers are, right? They work hard for people because they work hard for teachers because teachers work hard for them, right? They replicate, they mirror your behaviours, and I honestly, it's extraordinary the level to which that is true. And I was literally watching. I was watching a lesson the other day, week before last, and it was a price. It was priceless. It's a primary lesson, year 6. We all know where year 6 are post SATs, and there was a cover teacher teaching the lesson, and he was in his chair and he was getting lower and lower in his chair as he flicked through the slides, and you could watch the kids do exactly the same thing. Right? They were getting as lazy as he was about the lesson. It was fascinating. So the last one for me is work hard. Right? Work really hard for these kids, and then they'll do anything for you, right? And that's not popular stuff to say, but these teachers work really hard, and actually were nourished by working hard. Coming back to what you said, Steve, but they were nourished by the hard work because everybody was learning. And my final point is, if we're going to solve the recruitment crisis and we're going to solve the attendance crisis that we've got in schools, pupil attendance crisis, we've got to make classrooms lovely places to be, right? Where everybody's having fun. Every single teacher and every single pupil in these classes were really enjoying themselves. And it was just it was a joy to go and see. When my copy editor was editing the books, they had to keep scoring out the line, "It's been a joy, it's joyful," because I was just going on about it all the time. But it really was, and it was such a refreshing thing to be in classrooms where people were really learning loads and enjoying themselves. And the final point to make, going back to Rob Cohen, where it all started, while I don't believe in the kind of binary nature of stuff, so too much of educational debates all binary. So Rob has written the introduction to the book, and it's a beautiful introduction. It's a lovely, quantitative, forensic opening to the book, where mine is much more narrative and qualitative. His is really, really sharp. And I think what we've agreed, I certainly think this, is that Rob and I are talking about the same thing, right? So every teacher who showed these 10 attitudes and behaviors, their pupils were making phenomenal progress. So if you have a really high value added score, it's really likely you're going to be showing these 10 behaviors and attitudes. And it's just two sides of the same coin. The first woman I went to see, and you'll understand P8 scores, right? She's a drama teacher down in Cambridge. Over the last decade, her average Progress 8 score for drama is plus 2.8. That's nearly 3 grades higher, on average, over a decade, than predicted. Unbelievable, right? Extraordinary. So that's the book. That's what we do.
It's really interesting that we kind of ended that point on grades. And the bit that I jump in there is the grade and the growth and the Progress 8 actually a byproduct of all the things that you talked about? It's like, Job, in business, if you focus on the money, you forget all of the key fundamentals. If we focus on enjoyment and learning and all the other things, in regards to whatever approach, I think there's been a battleground for a long period of time in terms of tradition versus and skills versus knowledge and all that other stuff. But ultimately, what's beautiful is that actually school A and school B can be very, very different. Teacher A and teacher B can be very, very different. As long as there's joy, as long as they're enjoying it and the learners are enjoying it, actually, the grade is probably a byproduct potentially of all of that, because actually the focus is not on that grade rather than, oh, we have to do this because of the exam, we have to do this because of the exam, because you need that grade. And things. If you focus on actually this bit here that you talked about, those 10 principles, actually the grade is a byproduct.
A really good example of that, Steve, is I get slightly depressed when I'm asked to do a curriculum review and I get the paperwork and I look at the year 10 overview for English, and term 2 will be paper 1 questions 1 to 3. That's not a curriculum. That's just paper 1 questions 1 to 3, right? Why not get 6 brilliant essays, right? Because it's really about how you deconstruct writing. 6 brilliant essays about different things about the world, and analyze those and introduce children to brilliant writing, and then right at the end deconstruct it for the exam, right? Teach them how to write brilliantly and and look at brilliant writers of the world, not some bloody, I don't know, newspaper article. Some brilliant writers about all sorts of different aspects of the world, and then do the bit for the exam in February of year 11, right? Let's just teach gorgeous stuff. But that's not what I see very often, and I understand why. Blimey.
And yeah, we totally, because if the tail's wagging the dog, and I think that's what we talk about. I think you're saying the same thing, is that teach really, really well, care about your subject, care about how you make sure that students understand that rather than just moving on to the next thing. And it's not just about exam rhetoric, although that isn't in itself, in the system that we're in, something we need to do. It's not the be all and end all. And I look back at, I was a religious studies teacher in secondary, and I remember there's no R in STEAM anywhere. Religious studies, if there's anything getting pulled, they're getting pulled from RE and PE, right? So every time they had to have extra maths, English, science, it was always from RE, because it didn't really matter. Now, they made everybody do a GCSE in it, but it didn't really matter. 2 lessons a week or whatever else it was, do the full curriculum. And I look back and I think I was really good at drilling and getting kids to drill, and then wondered why I had some kids that absolutely loved RE and some kids that didn't. And what I found was those kids that wanted that memory test and that ability to be able to just be able to recite things and regurgitate things would do really well. And then I took them to A-level, and those A-level kids that needed to think a little bit and have to have an opinion, they really struggled. And it's when I started teaching A-level that made me rethink everything that I did all the way through from year 7 to 11. And the reason why was because I didn't care as much about what they could regurgitate, facts, figures, numbers, although that has a place. It was the way to engage with it. And I think what you're talking about there is something from that. I read something in the secondary book, and the example was, I jumped straight to the teacher about Jack, who was the English history media EPQ teacher. And I thought that was the most relevant to my subject when I went to have a look. And I thought what I really liked about one of the things he talked about is about register questions. And I just thought that ability for people to question and to think about something a little bit, maybe a bit tangential, but a little bit creative, and the students got some agency and involvement in some of that. I thought that was a really lovely example, because what I'm talking about in terms of students not being able to really be passionate about a subject is because if all you're doing is drilling on being able to do this, you lose the love of the learning in the first place, right?
Exactly, Ben. So thinking about RE, so we didn't do the GCSE in year 10 or year 11, but we had a brilliant bloke called Robin, and I'd read Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning, which I think is a phenomenal book. And I handed it to him and the head of department, and they said, well, we're going to make this the set text for year 10. And they ran a philosophy for life course, right? So they started with the Stoics and all the way through Nietzsche, everybody, right? And they began with the question, what is happiness? And the kids wrote down what they thought happiness was. And then at the end of the course, an hour a week, non-examined, what's happiness? Completely changed their ideas about life, right? And you imagine the debate you had. And it wasn't based on any exam. It was pure education. And that difference between schooling children to jump through hoops and education is quite marked. And I think one of the things I loved in my career was teaching the IB and teaching theory of knowledge in the IB. And how do we know what we know? Great question. Just a great question. How do we know what we know? If only in the current climate in this country, everybody was asking, how do we know what we know? And not just saying, well, I heard Nigel Farage say it, or I heard it on, I heard it this, that, or the other, and questioned what we're being asked and what we're being told, we'd be a better nation. So I agree entirely, and I'm not naive about it, because in the end, my job depended upon staying in my job for 18 years. I had to get some decent results, right? So I'm not naive, but I was really clear. You didn't have to do any extra lessons in the run up to exams. You didn't have to do any extra after school revision sessions or anything, or coming on Saturdays, anything like that, unless you wanted to. That was your call. I wasn't going to make you do it, because the lessons are the thing. The learning that goes on in those lessons, where behaviour is great and children are completely entranced and immersed in what you're teaching them, that's what counts.
Sorry, just trying to find my unmute. And I'm just thinking in terms of the difference between, because we focused on secondary there, and Ben, I know that your teaching background was there. I was FE and PE. I couldn't be further away from all of these different things. I taught running, skipping, and jumping when people had made a choice. When people had reduced it down, these people made a choice in further education to come and study it. But I was I was a governor at secondary, and then a chair of governor for a period in primary. What I loved about primary is the ability to explore and the player context and everything else. Did you find joy easier to find in primary with their delivery, or actually are the same shackles? I'm just interested, because obviously the number of variation in terms of the amount of secondary compared to primary. Did you find that actually similarities, or did you find that actually there's a more openness and willingness to explore the kind of content you wanted for the book in the primary section?
No, I draw the same conclusions about the attitudes and behaviours, and it goes all the way through. So if David Williams was making up an early years teacher, he would call her Mrs. Digger, but mine's called Mrs. Digger, right? Unbelievable, and she's absolutely brilliant, and the kids were great. And I interviewed 5 4-year-olds about Mrs. Digger, and it's my favourite passage in both books. If you haven't read it, so I'm sitting down with 5 4-year-olds, and usually when I spoke to the children, I'd say, "Okay, I'm going to write a book about your teacher," and they get really excited. "Can we be in it? Please, can we be in it?" Blah blah blah. I told these 5 4-year-olds, "I'm going to write a book about Mrs. Digger." Nothing. Not impressed at all. I said, "Okay, what makes Mrs. Digger such a great teacher?" I was in my full kind of play school mode. "A great teacher." And Owen says, "I had 2 birthdays before I was 3. Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, that's useful. And then it got, I found out they like Mrs. Digger because she gives them hot chocolate at Forest School, obviously. Right? Why wouldn't you like Mrs. Digger if she does that? And they told me some words they'd learned, like I, do, we, play, and stuff like that. And then it kind of came to a crux where I had thought, this is over. They started playing How Far Can You Reach Across the Table, and ignoring me completely. And then Emily leaned across to me, looked me in the eye and said, "I've just farted." At that point, I just gave up. Right? But they were brilliant, right? They were absolutely brilliant. And when you see a teacher like Helen Digger marshal those children, right? 30 4-year-olds, autonomous beings. Give me 30 gnarly year 11 boys teaching Romeo and Juliet any day than 40 and 30 4-year-olds, right? I wouldn't know where to start. Just utterly skillful stuff. Brilliant teaching. And all the way through, I saw teaching that led to success, right? This is really important. Teaching that what I don't want to get is anybody to get the sense that these teachers weren't on it. That children were learning all the time, and children were fueled by the success. And one of the phrases I used back in the day, I think it was Seneca who said, success nourishes them they can because they think they can, right? And they were being successful, and the more they were successful, the more they were successful. It was so interesting. And as many people say, and I always use there's a line from Daniel Moyes, who was head of research at Ofsted, and in his book from 2011, he said that self-concept has less impact on achievement than achievement has on self-concept. And what he means by that is stop telling people they're great, right? Because that does nothing for them. Doesn't big up their self-concept at all. Make them successful. Then they think they can do something. They can do the next thing, and then get them successful at that. So the best thing you can do to create a great self-concept and great confidence is teach well, and then children will learn more.
Just on that point as well, I'm always going to just dig into those bits in regards to what the measure that we put on children in regards to what makes them be great in education. So ultimately, we talk often that ultimately, if it's just based on that grade or that snapshot in time or particularly that, how do we ensure that success actually is a more of a holistic, rounded view of a learner rather than just putting one benchmark on that concept?
I think it's a huge point. So I got to know one of my books. I don't know if you know, but I wrote a book in 2017 called Mind Over Matter: Improving Mental Health in Our Schools. And I argue strongly, I think in the end in that book, that the best thing we can do for mental health in schools is teach well, right? And we've got to draw a line about some of the stuff that's going on about mental health. And I got to know during writing that book the government's advisor on mental health, Sir Simon Wesley. He's the only Regius Professor of Psychology in the country and the only Regius Professor of King's. And he's the only man I know, only person I know who's been on Desert Island Discs, right? So I generally know him, and he's been on Desert Island Discs. He's that big a fish. And I interviewed him for my live webinar called Leadership 55 for Haringey, and it's a 55 minutes of leadership wisdom. And he was completely off record. And he was really open. It was fascinating. And I wrote it all up, did a lovely 4,000 word essay on it. And he said, you can't publish that, John, because I'll be slaughtered, right? Because I said things that were pretty personal views. But he was really interesting. And two things he said there. He said, the stuff that causes mental health issues, if they are mental health issues, or causes anxiety for kids in schools, aren't likely to be solved by medicalization and a medical solution. And he said, it's a brilliant line. And he said he went to he said, things like mindfulness aren't devised for schools and aren't devised for people who aren't qualified to deliver them, right? So and loads of schools have mindfulness sessions. I think mindfulness is rubbish. I think it's been proved that the myriad scheme for mindfulness in schools didn't work. Actually, caused more trouble than it was worth. You go and look at the research. And then another thing he said, which was really interesting, come back to your point, Steve, was that his Michael Rutter. So Michael Rutter was his tutor, and so Michael Rutter wrote a book about the impact of secondary education on children in their lives. And they did a longitudinal study over 40 years. And the pupils, the cohort of pupils who had a terrible upbringing, had a terrible childhood, just the worst childhood you can imagine, 40 years on, that cohort, the ones who were successful in that cohort were successful at something at school. Didn't matter what it was, even if it was just being good looking, they did all right in life. They were successful at something at school. The ones who had a terrible upbringing and were not successful at anything had a terrible life. So the other thing I would reflect on, Steve, in response to you, is that if I had my time again as a head, I would big up success of any nature much more than I did, right? And I think that's the reason I didn't is because of the system, right? Because in the end, the thing I was judged on wasn't every child being successful. It was 5A to 2 in English and maths, and then it was a P8 score, right? And I think I braved that enough. I kicked back on that enough, and created a really great culture to work in at Huntington. If I had my time again, I would big up success of any nature for every child.
Yeah, I hear that, and I know that we might have some different views on mindfulness and wellness and meditation. That's best. That's okay, and that's the brilliance of a broad church, and I think. But what I do agree with, for absolute sure, is the nature and the impact significance of great teaching on well-being, and that's where I know you're absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I know that when you're writing, and we'll put the link in the show notes to your website, johntomsett.com, but also your writing where the blog post is this much I know about. And I really like that we're coming from our perspective and how we know what we know, but it comes from how do we know what we know? It comes from a research perspective. It comes from an experience perspective. It comes from an awareness and a philosophy perspective. It doesn't have to just be one size fits all. I know that we've only scratched the surface on some of the conversations around the book or around the books, and I really wanted to get into conversations about culture that are in one of your earlier books and how we create ideas around love rather than fear, which maybe we'll invite you back. Well, hopefully we can invite you back for a second conversation.
Those classrooms, Ben, were full of love. It was so lovely 10 years after I read that first book, Love Over Fear, Creating the Culture for Truly Great Teaching, to see truly great teaching and truly great teachers happening in a climate of love. It's just the best end, near end of my career.
Well, do you know, I had the privilege, and I know that he's not necessarily on this from the same trajectory in terms of thought processes and style of teaching and learning. I met Ron Berger the other day like it was like a hero moment, right? Especially it was a hero moment for me to meet him. And somebody asked him, "What does it mean to have a whole education? What does a whole education, a holistic education mean?" And he paused. If Ron Berger is one of those people that, like, where he just paused and he just went, "It's about love. It's about love." And if you love what you do and you love young people and you love making a difference and you love seeing their lives transform and if you love that, then everything else. And craziness is that I got asked the same question on camera, and before I knew what Ron Berger had said, I said, "I think you just have to care." And I was thinking about Howell Roberts' book about botheredness. I was thinking about my own experience of teachers that cared about me and my experience as a teacher about caring. And if you just give a shit, like, it matters, doesn't it? And then if you do that, and then you've got a skill to be able to pull that out and help young people give a shit and be bothered and care and love in that space, I think it's really powerful. And again, we'd love to invite you back to have another conversation about lots of it, because I think that there's lots there. But just to be respectful of everybody's time, we always finish our podcasts with 3 quickfire questions.
Go on.
Okay, so I'll do the first one. Steve will do one, and I'll do the other one. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on this. So the first question is: if schools were judged like restaurants by how much customers actually enjoyed the experience, what would change overnight?
Oh, that's a great question. I think you would change the accountability system.
Very quick fire. Love that, John. He was like, "I'm only giving you a couple. It's quick fire." Okay, next one. What is the most dangerous myth that educators tell themselves to avoid real change?
At least one person in the class learns it.
Great answer. Love that. And our final question is: if a 10-year-old, and you'll probably ask them this, if a 10-year-old asks you why they have to go to school, what would you actually say?
Oh, I can't think of a great answer here. So yeah, I think the first 2 answers were okay, but this one's probably going to be a bit naff. Because you're going to find out more about the world than you will do if you stay at home, I think.
Perfect. We've had so many people that these quickfire questions are really getting people to think, and it's great that they're then having to put it out in a quickfire way. But there's a lot in regards to the variation and the diversity that we have on the podcast that all do sit into that actually there is a reason. It's not actually explaining what the reasoning is, but actually you'd be better for it. And whether that, some people have talked about the social element and lots of different things, but ultimately we just hope that you're better and your time's not wasted by being at home. Because if that's the case and you can be better being at home, then let's challenge everybody and stay at home and stay away from education. But it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah,
what
agreed.
I should have shown is here's a picture of my younger self with a man with a fancy tie.
That's a ridiculous tie he wears.
He's renowned for his fancy ties. That is just over 10 years ago in June 2015.
When Steve used to have really high hair.
When my beard was a little bit fuller and my hair was a bit longer, and I've not had to just sweep it across because to get away from the balding.
But what I do sometimes is get my camera and put it on top of my head, and you realise how cool it is.
Just like chin upwards.
It's
but that also adds a different dimension if you don't have a beard sometimes, depending on how well you've eaten that weekend. But Johnny, it's been an absolute pleasure. We've loved it. It's been great. It's wonderful to have read and been sent the copies of both books. Both of them are very, very different, but actually the themes have come out, like you say, from both primary and secondary. It's been great that we don't always agree on everything. In terms of some of those bits, but actually, positive conflict and exploration around those is always a good thing to have, and that's what we need to force into our conversations. It's great that actually we're getting more of these conversations that are coming from the research ed perspective and all those kind of things onto the podcast, because we want all diverse views and thoughts and processes rather than just those people who are seen as progressive or whatever they were defined as previously. So we've loved it, and we really appreciate it, and thank you for your time today. It's been great.
Great. Thank you so much.
John.
Take care. See you. Bye.